Hey, Luke family, I hope that you're doing well. It's the summer months, and I hope that you're getting some time to rest and to recuperate. Well, as a part of that, we put a pause on all of our activities here at the Luke Church. It's our Sabbath month, where we take an opportunity to kind of pause, rest, and reflect. I do hope that during this time you're still digging into God's Word, discovering the riches of good news that the gospel brings to us, and also developing some important spiritual disciplines of prayer. If we ever needed that, we sure do need it right now. Well, during this time of pause, we want to take some opportunity to just share in the month of July a couple episodes from my newest podcast entitled Keep Standing. By the way, if you haven't had the chance, I want you to go on YouTube, make sure you like, subscribe, and also comment. Some good comments. And then also you can listen to us on Spotify as well as Apple Podcasts as well. We want you to help us to share the good news about how this podcast, it might be encouraging you and encouraging others. Tonight, I want to share with you an episode that I had with my good friend and mentor, the Reverend Dr. DeForest Soaries Jr. On this episode, we talk about leadership, personal responsibility, and how our faith helps us to deal with the challenges of systemic change. I think this is going to be an important one and a real appropriate conversation in this season that we're in. So I want you to dive into this conversation, share with somebody else, let them know that you're hearing this, and then help us again to share the good news. So be encouraged. And I look forward to hearing from you real soon.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Keep Standing with Dr. Timothy W. Sloan. And today we've got a special guest, a dear friend of mine, Dr. DeForest Soaries Jr. Dr. Soaries is one of the most trusted voices in our country. He's a political strategist, a prophetic voice. Over 30 years of pastoring the First Baptist Church of Lincoln Gardens. He's also a former Secretary of State for New Jersey. He's a D-Free founder. He's a financial guru. He is so much to so many, a mentor, and an incredible voice for our future generations. Today, I want to welcome Dr. DeForest Soaries. Dr. Soaries, first of all, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to have you on the show today. And tell our audience a little bit about who you are and kind of what you're doing, what you're working on now.
Well, first of all, thank you, Reverend Sloan. You have been an inspiration to me since we met. Your work at the Luke Church has just been phenomenal, and I'm just grateful to God for our friendship and relationship. You and your wife are just special people in my life. I am passionate about solutions. That's exactly who I am. When people ask me what I do, my mission in life is to solve problems. Now, you have to know that that is an outgrowth of my being an activist. I started when I was 16 as an activist. And the best way to understand activism is that the role of the activist is to identify and amplify problems.
Yeah.
And so activists necessarily point to situations that are unjust, point to events that are unfair, point sometimes to institutions that need to treat people better. And I did that for the first few years of my life out of when I left being a teenager, right? So I worked for Jesse Jackson for 3 years and helped him when he first started Operation Push. But as an activist, I felt that I'd spend the rest of my life pointing out problems, but not solving problems. So I made this mental, spiritual, emotional shift from a problem identifier to a problem solver. And the problem that I'm focused on most acutely today is the problem of financial fragility,
Right.
meaning a big chunk of this country consists of people who are financially fragile.
Right.
Now, I know a lot of people look at the financial realities. They look at poverty, which is important. They look at the wage gap, which is important. They look at the income gap, which is important. But the reality is financial fragility is probably the biggest challenge because America's dirty little secret is that a large percentage of people cannot afford a $400 emergency. Yeah. A large number of people who are making six figures are living paycheck to paycheck. And a large number of people don't have wills, don't have enough saved for retirement, and it is a real threat to the nation. And of course, Black and brown people have this reality at higher percentages than everybody else.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's what D-Free is. D-Free has become a real comprehensive effort with content and activities and building community to help people overcome financial fragility, some of which is driven by public policy and some of which is personal behavior.
Yeah. Well, and I know that's how I've connected with you, was watching you on CNN with Soledad O'Brien talking about helping people, achieve some level of financial freedom. So you've been doing that for years. I mean, decades of dealing with financial freedom. So when we talk about today in culture that is just really obsessed with these luxury lifestyles, I mean, you go on social media and it's constant competition to see who's posting what, and influencers are trying to promote so many different lifestyles. When we talk about that and you're trying to change the trajectory of our financial freedom and how we handle money, what's the biggest lie that people believe today?
Well, the biggest lie is that you are what you own.
Yeah.
And that who you are is defined by what you wear. We are, in that sense, the targets of major psychological warfare, because advertising and marketing today is structured not to promote the functionality of a product, but to promote the feeling derived from owning the product. And so you'll see models, scantily clad, standing next to a car, and what they're selling is tires.
Mm-hmm. Right.
but the subliminal message is that if you buy these tires, you'll be attractive to someone who looks like this supermodel. And it's just a lie. And so the advertising industry, before they release an ad or an ad campaign, will have it signed off by a psychologist. Because psychologists understand how to enter into the emotional and psychological space of the consumer. And so advertising and marketing, because it is basically a psychological strategy, have to be countered with psychological, spiritual offsets to help people understand that you can feel just as important in a Toyota as you do a BMW. That you can look just as good in a non-designer shirt that you do in a designer shirt. But we've become so mesmerized by brand that we will spend more than we can afford to look a certain way, and then it is influenced by celebrities, and within the context of celebrity culture, we emulate people that are really frauds themselves, because many celebrities are not as rich as they look. So I read, there's a book written by a Harvard professor called Juliet Schor, who wrote a book called The Overspent American. And in that book, she talks about what we used to call keeping up with the Joneses.
Yeah.
And keeping up with the Joneses back in the day basically meant if your next door neighbor got a certain car, you'd feel a certain kind of pressure to buy that same car. And what Dr. Schor says is that at least when we were keeping up with the Joneses, they lived in the same neighborhood as us.
Yeah.
But keeping up with the Kardashians, these people don't live anywhere near us. So now keeping up with the Joneses has turned into keeping up with people who are distant from us, who make more money than us, who have more elaborate lifestyles than us. And it is a dangerous reality that is really, I think, gone viral in our culture.
Do you have any optimism that will change that?
I only have optimism because people like you and churches like yours have been able to help solve this problem and help people overcome this crisis one family at a time. So it's a bottom-up movement. It's a bottom-up solution. There was a time in America when Black people basically accepted the status quo, and then we decided that we would accept it no more. And I think as we're forced to make these financial decisions. And when we look at our options and when we hear voices that we can trust and we see that other people are doing it, we actually have the makings of a movement where we can break out of this and really use money for our own and our family's benefit rather than making people who don't need our money richer than they are.
Yeah. Well, you alluded to kind of the responsibility of myself and so many other faith leaders who really do play a large role in kind of how we shape that conversation and change that conversation. So let's talk a little bit about kind of faith leaders and our role today. And if truth be told, that there is some division, I think probably over what we believe is socially, politics, even wealth. And so now there's a lot of people that think maybe the Black church has kind of lost its power in today's culture. Or do you think that the church is still the backbone of the community?
Well, I think most people who discuss the Black church and many people who lead Black congregations are not as familiar as we should be about the origins of the Black church.
Yeah.
When you look at the history of Christianity, for 2,000 years, there have always been schisms, there have always been differences in theology, and there have always been movements that grew out of movements. And so we saw the Greek Orthodox Church growing out of the Roman Catholic Church, and they disagreed over icons and other matters of theological substance. We saw Martin Luther in the 16th century and the 17th century. Those movements emerged from the Catholic Church over issues that related to papal infallibility and all of that. And when we look at the history of Christianity, there is only one major branch of Christianity that was formed not over theological differences, but over the issue of justice. The Black church, when Richard Allen walked out of that church in Philadelphia, he used the same hymn book, he wore the same clothing, they prayed the same prayers, they sang the same songs that the white church did. But they left over the issue of white Christians treating Black Christians unjustly. And so the Black church is the only branch of Christianity whose origins were around justice. And from the origins of the 18th century Black church, and then the Baptists came along, up until now, we are unique in that in that space. We are the unique branch of Christian religion. So having said that, the question becomes, how do we juxtapose ourselves to society in light of our origin and who we really are? We have an identity, we have a hermeneutic, we have a theology that's grounded in justice and to be the Black church. Now, there are churches led by Black people that don't function within the tradition of the Black church. But when I talk about Black churches, when I talk about our responsibilities as faith leaders, I'm talking about it within the context of the mission for the church to bring the message of Christ to bear in light of injustice. So for instance, right now, in states across the country and online, it is legal to charge people 400, 500, 600% interest on payday loans. It's legal, but it's unjust because the people who take out those loans are the people who are having the most difficulty financially. They're the most stressed financially. And Black churches are the institutions that should be advocating for public policies to make those kinds of loans illegal.
So then the criticism is that the Black church has sort of stopped being advocates towards issues like that. Is that a real reality that really is kind of putting us in a dangerous place right now?
It's a reality because from 1619 to about 1970, the challenge, the problem, the obstacles were rather clear. You cannot come here. You cannot sit there. You cannot buy from this store. You know, the segregation that followed up on slavery was so explicit that we were able to unify around a consensus concerning the problem. It became more complicated after 1970. After the public accommodations barriers were broken, after the Voting Rights Bill was passed, after the Fair Housing Law 1968 was passed, the major barriers that the civil rights movement were organized to dismantle were dismantled. And so now we enter into the 1970s and 1980s, and we get involved in exercising our rights. And the rights that we exercised the most were our voting rights. So if you look at the difference between 1960 and 1980, there was an explosion of black elected officials because we had this pent-up demand for people to vote who were disallowed to vote. But in terms of economics, in terms of family structure, in terms of education, we did not make as substantial gains in those areas as we did in politics. And so the complications that emerged in the post-civil rights era caused many of us to focus either on one area over the other or on no area at all. Because the other thing that happened is this, and you went to Morehouse, and so you get this better than most. For most of our existence as a people in this country, traditional black culture, traditional black values, the African influence on blacks in America aligned so neatly with core Christian principles that you were almost Christian de facto if you were black, because the emphasis on family and the extended family, the emphasis on community, the emphasis on leadership. The African chief and the black pastor have a lot in common. The traditional African chief translates into a role for black pastors that white pastors don't have. If you have white pastor friends, there are white pastors who basically are employees of their church. They have no real leadership authority. They preach on Sunday, and there's a whole group of people that run the church. The black pastor is the tribal head in the black church and in the black community. And so what happened was, in the post-civil rights era, as the culture changed, as black culture changed, listen, we went from 1960s singing in the secular world, "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud." In the early 70s, we were singing "Freddie's Dead" on Superfly. The values of black America as we integrated into what the Dr. King called the burning house. Dr. King said, "My fear is that we're going to integrate into a burning house." That's exactly what happened. So our values began to integrate with the larger society, and so our families got weaker. Drugs began to become a greater threat, and it became much more complicated in the post-civil rights era than it was in the pre-civil rights era. And I think now we have to identify what the major challenges are, how we can organize around those challenges, and pull together coalitions of conscience that can really attack areas of injustice.
Well, so when we talk about that and we get clarity that that's where we should be going, but then there's also the criticism of the church where, you've been in the boardroom, you've been in the pulpit, you were able to walk that line. But for many today, there's this question about, our corporations exploiting faith communities. And then you have faith leaders who may be, really engaging in business, but there's some who say you shouldn't. Is there a conflict of interest between maybe a faith leader says, I really want to be engaged in business, but I also know that I have a prophetic responsibility?
Right. Well, Moses didn't have the kind of relationship with Pharaoh that Nehemiah had with his king, So different times lend themselves to different realities and different responses to power, because the issue is power. How do humans accumulate and exercise power? Corruption is not a given. Corruption is always a possibility. And what faith leaders have to decide is what behavior, what articulation, what relationships actually function to the benefit of the people they lead. Because the definition of selling out is when you leverage the position that you have in the community to do things that only benefit yourself. And I think that's the critical thing, whether it's in business, whether it's just in the pulpit, we have to decide who among us are willing to make sacrifices, make decisions, form relationships that in your benefit to Black people, at the very least, the people that we lead in our congregations. I mean, when I was pastor of First Baptist, I didn't declare leadership for all Black people in central New Jersey, but I was the leader of the people that elected me as their pastor, which meant that every day I had to look for opportunities to do things that would benefit my congregation, the surrounding community, and their families. So that's, I think, the litmus test. The litmus test is who benefits from our behavior, who benefits from our activities, who benefits. And if the pastor is the only one who benefits, or in a larger sense, if the church proper, the building, the members are the only beneficiaries, then are we in fact fulfilling our role to rebuild the walls as Nehemiah did?
Yeah. You know, when you talk about that, you got to engage with not just our roles of faith leader in the church, but also you got to talk the political climate today. And I don't know if people know this, but it's a little unsettled right now. And so, you know, with so much, you know, anxiety around what's happening politically, and you've been at the highest levels of government.
Yeah.
You have worked on some of the most important issues, especially when it comes to voting rights. Now, when it comes now to Black voter empowerment, and we're constantly talking about got to get people out to vote, got to get you to the polls. But what's the most urgent issue when it comes to Black voter empowerment?
Well, the most urgent issue is to really resist those forces that are seeking to dismantle voting rights for Black people. Now, what's interesting about this is that a real analysis of the anti-Black vote is still very much a partisan analysis. In other words, if 95% of Black people vote for one party, then it's not in the interest of the other party to make it easy for them to vote. Look at the history of voting in this country, whether it was voting rights for women, voting rights for Black people, voting rights for ex-felons, voting rights for 18-year-olds versus 21-year-olds. What you'll notice is that the party that advocated for expanding the franchise was the party that perceived the expansion would benefit them. Straight through, all the way back to the 18th century. So when the Democrats thought that giving more people the right to vote would help Democrats, they were for it. But when they thought that expanding it would not benefit Democrats, they wouldn't be for it. There's a marvelous book that describes this in great detail called The Right to Vote. And that book chronicles all of the movements that sought to expand or to reduce voting rights. And every single time. So right now, most Black people vote for Democrats. I promise you, if 95% of Black America registered Republicans, the Republicans would try to expand voting rights for Black people. So it's politics with the underbelly of racism all the time.
Yeah. So let's talk about that point. So then, you know, many people, the big criticism is we're too loyal to one political party. Is that something that, you know, Black folk ought to talk more about?
Well, I think it is. It's very hard, however, to talk about political options when one party is just so explicitly insulting and offensive and demeaning. When George Wallace ran for president back in the early 1970s, obviously Black people did not support him, even though they were Democrats. So there have been times, I know in Chicago, many people are old enough to remember the Black Panthers. The Black Panther Party had a leader in Chicago named Fred Hampton, and Fred Hampton was the victim of a police assassination led by a Democratic law enforcement. And Black people in Chicago around 1970 ended up voting for a Republican in response to the assassination of Fred Hampton, which had been led by a Democrat, and no city was more democratic for black people than Chicago. So there have been moments when black people have shifted in response to something very specific. But it's very hard today for the Republican Party specifically to attract black votes when they are so demeaning and insulting and derogatory when it comes to describing black and brown people. But theoretically, if you just look at political theory and political science, the groups that the groups that do best, the Jewish community, the Hispanic communities, the LGBTQ communities, all of these communities are effectively negotiating with both parties in every election because their voting patterns suggest they are willing to go either way. Nationally, the black vote has not proven to be willing or able to shift significantly from the Democratic Party. And I think that that's a weakness, but it's a weakness that we can't really control until the Republicans behave in a much more respectful way towards black people.
Wow, this is getting so good. Well, we're going to pause here, and we'll be back for continue the conversation in the next episode. But before we go, Dr. Soaries, tell us how we can stay in contact with you.
Well, thank you so much. I've enjoyed being here. The easiest way to reach me is at my website, dbsoaries.com. Everything I do, every place I go, and every contact that I need to have can be done through that. My social media platform is DB Soaries. It's at DBSOARIES. All of my platforms, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X, it's DB Soaries, at DB Soaries. So thank you.
No, thank you so much. And thank you. Appreciate you for joining us for another episode of Keep Standing. Don't forget, if you haven't, subscribe, like, tell your friends, share about this podcast. Till next time, keep standing.